Welcome everybody to the first video I'm making for my new channel. I just started off, and it's going to be a channel that's going to be talking about Star Trek comics. I've been a fan of Star Trek comics since probably the late 60s, early 70s, when the show was on the air in syndication. And Star Trek comics have been around ever since, going through the 70s with Gold Key, the 80s with DC, and Marvel, and then winding up with the independents now in the 2000s. So a long, storied history of great and not so great Star Trek stories in comic book forms. And we'll also look at Star Trek as a pop culture phenomena. We'll probably talk about some of the new shows on the air like Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard, especially how they tie into the comic book series. And hopefully this will be a little niche here for all you guys out there that love comic books like I do and also love Star Trek like I do. So hopefully this channel will grow. It'll get a little bit more high tech from the low tech beginnings it is right now. Maybe we can do some live streams and do some chatting about Star Trek and comics. And let me give you a little backstory. Back in the 70s, I started watching Star Trek in syndication. Of course, we all came home after school and watched Star Trek in the afternoons, usually around supper time. In my area in West Massachusetts, it was on from 4 to 6 every day. And I'd come home after school and get some fruit, some cheese, whatever, sit down for the TV, black and white in color, and get taken away to a great world. I vaguely remember Star Trek in syndication. In first run, maybe in the third season, vaguely. On the nights I could stay up that late. But when it hit the afternoons and the weekends and exploded onto television, which it did in the 70s, then I just, my whole life became embroiled in that thing called Star Trek. There was other things on, of course, in those days, Lost in Space and all the Irwin Allen shows, and I love those as well, but nothing really captured my imagination like Star Trek did. And I think it's the optimism of the show to this day, giving us a world to strive for and characters to be like. And, of course, comic books. I loved Marvel mainly back in those days, all the Marvel heroes, the Hulk and Thor, Submariner, Iron Man, all those guys. And then eventually, probably in the 80s, I got into DC, Flash, and Batman, and so forth. But even before then, Star Trek was out by a company called Gold Key. And of course, this is my first Star Trek book I ever bought. This was purchased in 1974. I think this is issue number 25. And I bought this around, I think, July or August of that year. Walked down to my local convenience store, to the spinner racks we all love. And I saw this issue sitting there. And of course, I had to have it. And 25 cents, expensive back in those days, probably like a $2.50 book now. But I wanted this book, and I can't tell you how many times I've read this and my other Star Trek Gold Key comics. But this was the first one I ever received. So we're going to look at this issue of Star Trek from Gold Key. I thought was appropriate as the first video on my channel because it was the first comic book really I ever bought. Before I even got into the Marvels and the DCs, this was it. So we're going to look at this pretty much in depth and talk about this comic book a little bit. And I'm going to show you some of the insides of the book and the artwork. So let's take a look at this right now. Okay, so let's have a look at this first comic book review on our channel here. Appropriately for Star Trek The Dwarf Planet Part 1. The thing about Gold Key Comics is I think I got onto this book about the right time because this was issue 25. And by issue 25, the book had been around a while and it started looking more like Star Trek. I don't know any of you have had a chance to look at some of the early issues of the Gold Key comics, but they are not very reminiscent of what Star Trek was on the screen, and there was a reason for this. Most of the artists were unfamiliar with Star Trek. They were sent some rough pictures and some sketch outs of the plots, but they didn't really see the show. So when they started doing this back in the late 60s, they had to kind of guesstimate how things were, and a lot of things are inaccurate. But it's those inaccuracies that really add to the charm of this title, because it really started out as a 50s, 60s pulpish space adventure that happened to be tinged with a little bit of Star Trek. In the early issues, Captain Kirk was Captain Kurt, and the Enterprise had rockets instead of nacelles, and they had teleportation devices instead of transporters. And as they went along and the comic evolved, because it was a pretty long run. I think it started in the late 60s and wound up somewhere in the very late 70s to early 80s. So in that time, the artwork got better. The Star Trek items were drawn better and were more relatable to the show. But the thing I loved about this book, and the reason why I read it for so long, was it was just such a fun read, and still very true to the feeling and the spirit of the show. Now this issue was basically Gulliver's Travels for the first half, where Captain Kirk and his party beam down to an alien world and find that they're besieged by items much smaller than themselves, as you can see them here in this village with the bonsai trees in the background. The interesting thing is, they by this time they had the shuttles looking pretty much like the shuttles on the show. The characters looked pretty good at this point to their TV show counterparts. You can even see in this one, though, that Lieutenant Uhura is Lieutenant Uhuru. So they didn't have quite everything exactly the same. I love this mixture of Oriental architecture with 1950s Finn vehicles here. That's fantastic. So they beam down and they find this deserted world. And then Captain Kirk gets attacked by looks like a child's toy, and then more child's toys, and then he winds up, oh my God, getting ensnared by these rockets until he's a la Gulliver, strapped to the ground with wires and little men coming out of vehicles here. But I love the artwork here, and it does look like Shatner, but it's just very pulpy and just fun. So of course he gets captured and wheeled into the planet's leader, who is a woman, aghast. A woman leader, more advanced world than many. I don't know what they were trying to say. And of course you have that one general who's a dick, and he's gonna capture Kirk, and he has nefarious plans. So you get into the middle part of this book, and it's pretty familiar, anybody who's read these Gold Key comics, that you'll get what I call the floating head exposition scenes. Every one of these books, they always had the plot being explained by somebody, a character from the planet, and you get these floating head panels where they go through and they tell you the whole story, basically, what happened to them and why they had to build the world they did. And usually those take up 2 or 3 pages. But that happens every single issue. But, it's fun to read. And then Kirk and his company there get a plan to basically reverse the effects of the radiation for the planet on the Enterprise. And, of course, they allow him to beam back up to the ship, but the general here, he's not going to have any part of this. and a la Toy Soldiers sneaks into a box. This scene reminded me kind of the episode Dagger of the Mind, where Van Gelder sneaks aboard the Enterprise in a similar crate. I wonder if they got the idea from that. So of course they're gonna leave Uhura here. The woman always stays behind as the hostage in these things, and they beam back up to the ship. And after a couple of your fine advertisements, we get part 2. These adventures were always split into 2 parts. And I like the drawing of the Enterprise here, and basically this is very faithful to the show at this point. And when we do some of the older books, you can see how this has changed. But not exactly. The bridge, of course, doesn't look like the bridge. But at least by this point, Scotty started to look like Scotty. He was a blonde man in the early adventures. So Scotty's going to go out. I loved this when I was a kid, because of course we never got this on the show. And in fact, we probably never got this until Star Trek First Contact, where they actually walked. Oh, I take that back. Star Trek The Motion Picture, where they walked on the ship. And then, of course, First Contact, they did the same thing. So Scotty's got to walk outside with his spacesuit and raise the deflector radiation disc here. I like this clang as it goes up. And, of course, Scotty is getting radiated because his suit ripped. And, oh, my God, an empty suit. Scotty's down the boot. And I like from this point on, Scotty's shrunk down because of the radiation, and there he is. And, of course, he's naked as a jaybird. And everybody comes in, and he's saying, "Give me some clothes. I need some clothes." So McCoy gives him a handkerchief. Mighty nice of him. And they got him in the old test tube here. And, of course, we get the toy soldier men come in, and they're gonna go ahead and throw a monkey wrench into all this. So Bones puts him in the old storage compartment. Never mind about getting security and taking him over to the brig. Just stick him in the storage compartment there, and you'll be all set. And of course, Scotty has to battle microbes because now he's small as a piece of dust, and he's got to go ahead and battle the microbe monsters. And pardon my dogs, they're barking like maniacs. We're gonna get that a lot as the show goes on. So Scotty, a la Kirk in Arena, has to go fight the monster, and he gets these microbes, the little pieces of dust in there, and of course he fights the monster and wins. I love this impression of Spock here as a mad scientist here with the mad beam machine here that's going to restore Scotty to his regular size. And they're all happy when that happens. They're, hurrah! Yahoo! Yee! That's fantastic. And of course, they leave a little joke at Sky's expense here as he's sitting there with the naked as a jaybird there. And Spock even has a little laughter at his expense. Ha ha ha. So who says Spock didn't laugh and smile back in the shows? And of course, at the end of the story, we get the moralizing in the bridge, so it makes you really feel like it's an episode of Star Trek as they go back to the planet and they solve the mystery. So that's my very first Star Trek comic, issue number 25. And as I said, I must have read this thing about 600 times when I was a 10-year-old. And I love these gold keys. So that's this issue. We're going to come back and let's wrap up this first episode of the show. Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for watching my first video today, and hopefully subscribing to the channel. If you like what you see, subscribe. And we'll be doing more of these videos. Next up, I'm going to be looking at the Star Trek The Motion Picture comic book from 1980 from Marvel. So thanks, everybody. We'll catch you in the next video. Keep on trekking.